Well, brilliant. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Lucy Burke, and I'm really delighted to be facilitating this conversation on the politics of disability on behalf of UCU's CPD team and the Disabled Members Standing Committee. This event is part of UCU's contribution to the Day of Action for Disability, Equality and Education, which is today, and it takes place in UK Disability History Month. I'm joined today by two fantastic activists, Ellen Clifford, who is author of The War on Disabled People, Capitalism, Welfare and the Making of a Human Catastrophe, which is an absolutely brilliant book that recently won the Bread and Roses Award for Radical Publishing. And also I'm joined by Thamisa Nichols, an academic and UCU activist based at Sheffield University and Vice Chair of UCU's Disabled Members Standing Committee and a member of the TUC Disabled Members Committee. So I'm going to invite Ellen and then Thamisa to share their perspectives on the politics of disability today. And then we're going to have a general conversation and take as many of the questions that we've been sent in advance as we can. But also we really would like to welcome everybody to contribute questions as we go along. And we'll take those as we go along and as we talk. So first I'm going to go to Ellen. Just to say hello and welcome. And you've written this absolutely brilliant book, which is all about really the kind of ideological onslaught that's occurred to disabled people in this country since 2010. So I wondered if you'd like to say a little bit about the context and what you explore in the book. And I think, the kinds of erosion of disabled people's rights that we've seen as a result of austerity, but also that we've seen intensified sort of during the COVID-19 pandemic, and also then perhaps about the ways in which disabled people have resisted what's been happening.
Yeah, so the book came about because I was actually approached by Z Books, who are radical publishers, and they'd noticed there was a disability-shaped gap in their catalogue. And I was, at that time, a member of Disabled People Against Cuts, which I still am, have been since 2011, and was also working as head of policy and campaigns at a deaf and disabled people's user-led organisation, Inclusion London. So I was really living and breathing what was happening from 2010 up until when I came to write the book, which was 2019, and seeing the dramatic regression of disabled people's living standards as the result of a deliberate and systematic programme undertaken by the succession of governments that we had led by the Tories since 2010. So it was covering, what had happened, and the attacks, as we call them, the attacks by the government had happened in every area of disabled people's lives. So I mean, that is a huge amount to cover, because not just social security, also social care, but also because disabled people, because we rely on support from public services disproportionately. So the NHS, but also disabled children and young people will require learning support, social housing. The majority of tenants left in council housing, 2/3, I think, are disabled people. So in every area where there were cuts, disabled people were being hit, and there was then the cumulative impact. And to justify it all, as I know everyone watching will be well aware, there was this narrative of benefit scroungers, which increased hostility against disabled people, as well for a time as giving cover to the Tories to pass these legislation and these policy measures that were having such not only disproportionate, but also very cruel impact on deaf and disabled people. And cuts to frontline services, such as advice agencies, were leaving disabled people with absolutely nowhere to turn. And that was something that no one who was working in the disability sector, even those who'd been around for a long time, had ever seen in their lifetimes. Situation where you have overwhelming demand with people contacting you in utter despair, and there's absolutely no place to signpost people. And the extreme end, you had people killing themselves, people dying as a consequence of having no money to live on and no support. But it was also the scale of it, I think, involving millions of people. And that's why the United Nations in 2016 made the finding of grave and systematic violations of disabled people's rights due to welfare reform and austerity. And since then, things only, unfortunately, continued to get worse. So I think there was an attempt to kind of summarize everything that had happened to kind of represent the scale of it and the impact, the devastating impact on people. But also I wanted to put it into the context of disability politics, and to show that although what the Tories did since 2010 was very nasty, it's not enough just to change the government. That this was happening within a context of the relationship between disability and capitalism, which means that so long as we live under a system that puts profit before people, disabled people will always have to struggle. During times of like economic prosperity, we might be able to get concessions, but as soon as there's recession, we'll be the first to be hit. And I think it's really important for disabled people to realize that, because otherwise it's more difficult to get an effective strategy for resistance. I think there were people, particularly in the early years of the coalition government, that thought that if we just evidence what's happening, that the government will go, oh, that was an accident, sorry, and reverse it. But I think, well, that's why I think it's very important to understand how disability fits within wider political economics, because then you understand the ideology that drives these people, and therefore where disability, well, where it fits in, and how they're able to target disabled people, the most vulnerable, as society likes to call us, for cuts. I suppose on the one hand, I wanted to record what had happened, but particularly, we can talk about it in a bit, but particularly the way that disabled people didn't accept what was happening, the way that we fought back, because disabled people often find ourselves written out of history. So we wanted to make sure that the agency that we'd had during the period did go onto the historical record, and to show things from our perspective. Also to make people who hadn't been living and breathing what was happening aware more, and aware of disability politics as well, because I think because of the marginalization and exclusion of disabled people within society, a lot of people just don't know what happens. They have misperceptions about what disability is, and they also don't have an interest in what happens. So a lot of what happens to us is unseen. And then the third thing was really addressing other disabled campaigners about the importance of that wider political and economic understanding. That was the idea of it anyway.
I mean, you explored that all brilliantly. I mean, I think one of the kind of really interesting things is how difficult it is for some people, it seems, to view disability as a kind of category of oppression, in the same way that they might understand other kind of sort of minority identities or other groups via that language. And I think that's where the kind of social model comes in. And I wondered if you could say something about that, because you make a really strong argument in the book for kind of going back and sort of politicizing and really thinking about the social model. So perhaps if you could say a little bit about that, that would be great as well.
Yeah, so the social model of disability is a way of looking at disability that disabled people, ourselves disabled campaigners, developed. And as I'm sure many people watching this will be aware, the key thing about the social model is it draws a distinction between impairment, illness, the conditions we live with on the one hand, and then disability as the oppression that society imposes on top of our impairments on the other, and that's why we prefer to be called disabled people rather than people with disabilities. The other key thing I would say about the social model is that it was never meant to be a perfect theory of disability. Its strength is in the fact that it is a tool for achieving social change. So I share the frustrations of yourself, Lucy, and other disabled people in how there is, I would say, a low level of understanding of the social model beyond disabled people ourselves. And I think that's such a shame, because actually the social model, or the social model helps us understand the nature of disabled people's oppression. And disabled people's oppression, I think, really shines a light on capitalism and how it works and how brutal it is and what a waste of human potential it is. So I always think it's a shame when people on the left don't fully understand disabled people's oppression. And what I was finding was that when I was researching, back through previous generations of campaigners, they shared exactly the same frustrations. So the League, I can't remember the name now. I think it was the League of the Physically Handicapped in the US, in the Depression era. And their allies on the left were kind of calling them cripples, and the poor cripples being dragged around by the police. And, that was really frustrating for them. This is, something that every generation of campaigners really has struggled with. But at the same time, I think that it isn't surprising, because we know that the dominant ideas of any time are the ideas of the ruling class. And because I think disability is such a powerful way of exposing the true nature of capitalism and the ideology of individualism, it shows that up, as to be what it is, a way of dividing us and separating us from from our communities. Making us focus on ourselves rather than interdependency, which is, I believe, the way that humans flourish. It's so brilliant at doing that of course the ruling class, the ideas of the ruling class, they're going to want to squash that and in fact turn disability on its head. So actually disability is the oppression that disabled people experience. It isn't the impairments, the what's going on in our minds and bodies that may cause us pain and distress, or it might just be a difference which is inconvenient for for capitalist society. Disability is oppression, and yet the majority of people associate disability with our impairments. They locate the problem of disability within ourselves, when actually the problem is capitalist society and the socioeconomic structures we live under.
Yeah, I think just finally before I bring Thamisa in, I think one of the things that always kind of that I find the most difficult is that language of othering that you get when people talk about our most vulnerable people. So I mean, and it happens across the political spectrum. You must vote for us because we'll care for our most vulnerable people, as if disabled people have zero agency and are not us. In that kind of discourse, and I think some of the most powerful kinds of critiques of austerity came from disability activism. So, I mean, perhaps if you could just say a little bit about, the kind of recent history of that activism around the sort of work of Deepak, for instance.
Yeah, we're frustrated by exactly those things that you just mentioned, the kind of othering, presenting us as as the vulnerable. But I think that we actually played quite an important role within resistance to austerity, because for disabled people, a lot of this was literally like a matter of life and death. The stakes were so high that we had to come out and we had to fight. A lot of people had literally nothing to lose, and so we were a lot less likely to be fooled by people trying to co-opt us, for example. Much more likely to want to take absolutely radical action. to go out on the streets, to do direct action, to encourage trade unions, to take industrial action, because this needed a very serious response.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, yeah, I just remember kind of talking to Debbie Jolly, sort of, you know, early on, you know, who really sadly and tragically sort of died around that, and particularly around the sort of the aftermath of 2012, when apparently everything was going to be great, you know, after the Paralympics and things like that, and then, you know, obviously, just massive and catastrophic kind of impact on people's lives. But I think that idea of people being able to have agency and resistance and fighting back is so important, to just challenge the kind of charity-based ideas that kind of lead to that sort of sense of, you know, sort of vulnerability and pity rather than solidarity and collective action, which I think is obviously sort of what's so important in challenging this stuff. Okay, so I'm going to thank you, Ellen. That was amazing. and I really would encourage everybody to read The War on Disabled People, because it is just a great book. So I'm going to bring in Thamisa Neckles now. Hi, Thamisa, and I know that you've got something you know, ready to share with us around your experiences and perspectives on the politics of disability.
Yeah, and thank you very much, Lucy. And that was a brilliant conversation you had there with Ellen. I look forward to speaking with all of us in the room. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks again for having me on this segment. My experience, the importance of the politics of disability, and what I think it means to me. Not every disabled person wishes to form their political identity around disability issues. There's also no guarantee that politically engaged disabled people will advocate for better disability policies. However, claiming disability, understanding it is as a common part of the human condition, understanding how impairment and social conditions interact to produce disability, and recognizing disabled people as an important minority group can impact formation of a political disability identity. The impact of the politics of disability are many, and I'd like to hone in on two ways in which disabled people's voices are silenced. Many local constituency headquarters are inaccessible, and hence it is very difficult for many of us to become grassroots activists and to feed into disability issues at this level. Secondly, although there are examples of disabled politicians at the local and national levels, it is also very difficult for many disabled political activists like ourselves to offer themselves as candidates at local or national elections, for the problems of both campaigning and door-to-door canvassing may prove to be impossible. So, even if these barriers to political participation were removed, it would not necessarily mean that the disabled population would conform into an active political force to which all political parties would need to take notice. Research suggests that there are a number of barriers and facilitating factors that affect and hinder disabled people's participation. Some of these include networks, recruitment and mentoring, resources, which I refer to here as money, time, and energy, the hierarchy of impairments, accessibility of political spaces and activities, and laws and policies. Some of the key recommendations in the literature suggest that overcoming these barriers would mean removing access barriers to political participation, from voting to holding office, including physical and procedural barriers in political spaces, ensuring that equalities legislation covers politicians, eliminating barriers imposed by benefit systems, promoting direct support for political activists, candidates and office holders with disabilities, including access to necessary services and support. encouraging parties to recruit and mentor disabled people with leadership potential, and considering quotas and job sharing. And these are only a few recommendations coming out of the research which talks about the ways in which we could eliminate some of the barriers to us participating and making our voices heard. However, there's a great deal of variety within the disabled population as a whole. Differences in social class, age, family circumstances, and clinical conditions, as well as the fact that disability may have developed after political commitments had been established. In addition, many disabled people do not necessarily regard themselves as disabled, and many of them choose not to disclose their disability. Or even if they do, they would not necessarily contemplate joining an organization for disabled people. As a consequence of disability, some people may disengage from political activity either because their physical impairment possesses limitations of a physical and psychological kind, or because they are aware that in many contexts they lack any basis for exercising power, for example, through the withdrawal of their labor. So within our educational context, and I speak as an academic now, as a Black female individual with a disability, I embody the ways in which categories of oppression, in this case race and gender, intersected with my disability to have an impact on my work experience. And this is really significant and really brings or gives further insight into what Ellen talked about and the experiences that disabled people have. And in my own experience, I reference Jennifer Walters, the She-Hulk. We know the relationship between Hulk and anger. So when we talk about the ways in which we have been oppressed, I think of myself in my own situation and I say not only because I'm strong and fierce, but because I'm also angry. So I'm perceived in a particular way. However, looks are very deceiving because anger as a Black disabled woman is a secondary emotion. The primary emotion is what you are hearing in my voice. It's what you see in my tears. I've been living with a hidden disability for 6 years, and due to my condition, I could no longer do my work as I would normally have. As an academic, I was not able to process information quickly. I was not able to read from a screen. I had to do my work differently. In addition to just getting a reasonable adjustment, which suggested that I could have software to help me to do my dictation and my text-to-speech work, I really needed additional time. And that time was never granted to me, so that I can do the work that was assigned. Although my requests were supported by specialists, these were met with various obstacles. So you can actually begin to conjure up your own imaginations of my feelings of oppression and anger and the She-Hulk coming out. So I don't want you to take my anger for aggression or my tears for weakness. Neither are true. I guess you could say my response to the underlying sense of frustration and sadness of dealing with perceived injustice, microaggression, oppression every day for a number of years was anger. And this took a heavy toll on my health and well-being. So when Ellen talks about the ways in which people respond and to the cuts and the oppressions that they have been faced, you could well imagine. I put another plug in. You need to read her book. You really do. The myriad of disability-specific programs and policies, the segregation of disabled people, the inability to gain access to organized society, to experience an integrated and adequate education, to obtain meaningful employment, and to socially interact and participate has resulted in a politically powerless and diffuse class of people who are unable to coalesce with other groups of disabled people on common issues, to vote, to be seen or heard. This class has accepted the stigma and caste of second-hand citizenship and the incorrect judgment of social inferiority. So, this is my contribution to this afternoon's presentation on the politics of disability. I know that I probably took a slightly stringent take and position. However, I feel that this is really important to understand the ways in which disabled people, as much as they would like to participate in the world of work, in the world of lobbying and becoming good activists, it is sometimes difficult. And the imposed cuts by the government doesn't make things easier for us. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Thamisa, for that. If we can bring Ellen back in, that would be amazing too. Thanks. Hi. Back. I think what's really interesting, Thamisa, about what you've just said, and I mean, it would be nice maybe to talk a little bit more about this, is a kind of culture or a system in which you're automatically made to feel as if there's a kind of lack or a deficit, or and that, when I think about how benefit systems work or how support systems work from a very, very early age for people, in order to receive any sort of support, the focus has to be on deficit and lack and what you don't and aren't able to do, and that often that's measured in time. How much longer does it take for someone to do this thing, as if time is also directly related to money as well, or the calculation of that. So rather than having a system that talks about what people need, what do you need to be able to do this, it's what do you lack, and then a judgment of that lack, and that means that a sense of kind of somehow of not being good enough, or of deficit is absolutely integral, and has profound impact on people's self-esteem, I think, or sense of themselves, or idea of themselves as valuable in and of, valuable in and of themselves, rather than in relationship to a kind of financial calculus or a cost benefit analysis. And I think that comes across in the ways you've talked about kind of struggles at work, Thamisa, but also I think that's integral to some of the things that have happened in the benefit system as well. Some of the more punitive changes as well have kind of really ramped that logic up. I don't know if you want to sort of say something about that, Ellen or Thamisa, to come back on that. Either of you, it's fine.
I can, if that's all right for me. I'm still developing my ideas on Thamisa. What you were talking about just made me think so many different things. But yeah, I mean, that deficit model is such an issue, but it's the judgment about the lack, as Lucy says, but then also it's about that perceived cost to everybody else, the idea that we are a burden on people because we can't, labour as productively in the ways that employers want us to, and therefore we have to be compensated in order to survive. But I think, and definitely that kind of that idea of disability is very much, imposed on us, and I don't think that disabled people often feel, there is a lot of disablest language used, attitudes have definitely been getting worse through the rhetoric that the government's used. And that's even before we got into the pandemic, with the idea that our lives are worth less than other people's. But I think that people do actually care. And I think that disability, it's a very powerful topic because people care. And it means that it can be the source of enormous unrest. And that's why capitalist governments give any form of disability support. I mean, there's no value in it for people who may never labour productively, in the workplace. There really isn't a value for capitalists. It's not like, investing in education or healthcare or something, or a pension. There isn't a value in it. Why do they do it? To prevent social unrest, because the reality is that particularly, within working class communities, we care about each other so much. We want each other to thrive. We don't actually resent having to spend money or share our resources with those we care about. I mean, obviously there's all the divide and rule rhetoric which makes people cruel to each other and see other people as the problem. But I think there is that care, which means that people will oppose measures when they think they're hurting disabled people. And that's why governments will do U-turns. Like Osborne had to do the U-turn when it looked like when IDS pretended to love disabled people and came out and said, I'm resigning because you're targeting disabled people. And Osborne had to do the U-turn then. There are often situations that governments are nervous of. One example of that always sticks in my mind is during the Third Reich, when the grey transport buses were coming to residential institution in a place called Absberg, and they were going to take away the disabled residents to be exterminated. And the villagers came out and tried to stop it. They didn't manage, but they saw those disabled people living in those institutions. So at a time when disabled people were forcibly segregated from society, but they still saw them as their neighbours, and they didn't want their neighbours to be killed and taken away. And I think it's important to remember that, that people do care.
No, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, clearly lots of people care because, as you say in the book, this is the biggest minority group, and these are people, even if people don't explicitly kind of identify as disabled, people we know have kind of need for support. For instance, older people, people with dementia. There are growing numbers of people who we know need support and get support, and often are getting support from people, lots of support from people who love them. But again, it's a kind of the fact that takes place in a kind of hostile, what I would say is a really hostile environment, to enabling that to happen in a way that is viable or livable for everybody, because you do also need those material. You do need that sort of material support to be able to do that, don't you? You need time. You need access to experiences or opportunities or different choices, and it's those that are being systematically kind of eroded.
And you have to fight for everything. And that's the thing, is that disabled people's experience of life is fight after fight after fight after fight for anything. And that's what, when Thamisa was talking about anger, a lot of disabled people, we get told we're just really angry and bitter. But actually, if we didn't have that anger, we wouldn't have a motivation to actually get up and keep going every single day. And it also made me think about, the resistance and the protests, and how many people, when they got involved with disabled people against cuts, they were saying, if I don't do this, then, I just want to give up on life. But through that sense of agency, but also through the peer support and through the sharing of information, people supporting each other just to get through, So I think that anger can be very positive. Unfortunately, it's imposed on us. We don't really have a choice. It's that or give up. Yeah.
So Misa, what? Yeah.
No, and I was just, I totally agree with that as well, and that's why it's so important for us to really hone in on the social model of disability and see the ways in which the model has strength in terms of helping us to remove the attitude and all the physical, the institutional barriers. And we're hoping for those things to improve. So the anger that we share and we see, and the ways in which we really have to become more resilient, more resilient than anybody else to fight for what we rightfully deserve. And it's good to know that communities will be fighting with us and supporting us and realizing and recognizing that it is a disservice to not stand up with us. So I just wanted to say that, but it's great strength in getting others to understand the importance of relying on the social model and removing those barriers to help our lives be more, I guess, to be more improved, to have a better quality of life. That's what I meant to say. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I've always felt really strongly that an accessible world is good for everybody as well. It's not, I think we could come to one of the questions here. So we've had some questions that were sent in advance of this webinar, and this really relates to issues around adjustments in the social model. And somebody sent in and said and sort of pointed out the argument that employers often say, well, we'd be happy to upgrade our disabled facilities, but the cost is too great. And they're asking what our suggestions would be to counter that kind of argument. I don't know if you've, Ellen, if you've experienced that, or if that's come up, but that sort of idea of, I've experienced that at work, but that sort of sense that it's expensive and disabled people are expensive.
I think they see it as expensive because they don't want to take the time to ask us what's needed so that everybody benefits. I mean, we have universities that are now investing huge amounts of money, millions of pounds in new buildings, not just, and refurbishing buildings. And they do what is the minimum requirement, to say they have met the minimum requirement for accessibility, and that's okay. And we understand that as individuals, we do have different needs. Everyone has a different need, but the more inclusive you can make institutions, the better. So it has to be a case where we need to continue lobbying, and from the stages where infrastructures are being designed and developed, we have to have that voice, and we have to be plugging in, within that space. We have to find some level of, activism, advocacy, someone who can, hear, but not only hear what's not happening for us, but also being able to enact and do something to make that change happen. There are little things that universities can do, and they just don't do it.
Yeah. I mean, Ellen, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, absolutely agree with Hamisa that there is money and people make choices about how that money is spent, and it's about priorities rather than whether the money is there or not. Government policy is that disabled people can work. According to ministers for disabled people, there's absolutely no reason why disabled people can't work. But these are the very real barriers that we face, and is part of that frustration of having to fight all the time. But there is equality legislation, and unfortunately, often that's what we have to resort to because people aren't familiar with our rights. They have ideas about, acceptable costs on individuals. And then we have to know it's really important that we know our rights and that we use them.
I mean, I think the one, you know, when we run our everyday ableism sort of webinar, I think, you know, often we do rely on sort of ideas of the Equality Act, and unfortunately that's often individualized, isn't it? So it often demands that something wrong has happened before you can exercise those rights and you have to exercise them as an individual. So it kind of individualizes what is often a systemic problem. But the one really good piece of you know, thing about the Equality Act is the public sector equality duty, which is a much more in keeping, I suppose, with social model thinking and that idea of an anticipatory duty, that in a place like a university that is and can anticipate having diverse people enter into it, you know, with diverse needs, could be actually anticipating those, you know, that will happen and not relying on an individual, but sort of saying we'll make all our facilities accessible. We'll make sure that how we deliver things is accessible, because we may well have, you know, numbers of students or staff with additional needs or particular support needs that we can sort of anticipate and preempt. And so, you know, I'd really hope that we could begin to really sort of, you know, sort of actually also shift from the individual to the collective responsibility for that. Yeah, for sure. So okay, so I've got some other we've had some other questions in, and some of them are quite big questions, so I'm going to ask them and see how we go with them. So one of the questions is, can we say something about neurodivergence, ableism and capitalism?
Yeah, shall I?
Yeah.
Yeah, so neurodivergence isn't a deficit, it's just a difference. And I suppose at the beginning, when we're talking about impairments, illnesses, and differences, this is a classic example of that. Common ideas about autism are that deficit model, and that's so destructive to people. But yeah, and the way that people have been treated throughout history. I'm thinking of a book I really like called Neurotribes by Steven Silberman, which kind of tries to shake up those traditional, really oppressive ways looking at neurodivergence. And I think there is a much better understanding now of what it means. But sadly, that isn't translated into any differences in the structures that we live under, which do make things very difficult, because the neurotypical world is so exclusionary, and employment is, a very strong example of that. We were talking, previously about reasonable adjustments and the argument that these can cost too much money, but sometimes they don't cost anything at all. But what I think is more challenging than cost for employers is where adjustments necessitate a different way of organizing work. I think over recent years, I think the labour's intensified, but I think there's also been greater and greater and greater standardization, which kind of fits with taking a lot of autonomy away from workers. And so diversity in terms of thought and learning and understanding is even less catered for than it was before. And I think that what is happening is the people who can fit within the kind of standards expected in the workplace is becoming narrower and narrower and narrower. And I think that the proliferation of disability that we're seeing is because of that. It's not that, demographically, we know that there are, babies being born who are living longer. We've got people living longer in older age. So some of that is demographic. But for me, I think there's also something about more and more people starting to identify as disabled because they're finding themselves on the margins or being excluded. And I think that is directly tied to the particular phase of capitalism that we're in, and on the kind of response of capital to the economic climate, which has been just to squeeze workers harder and harder. So yeah, I kind of see all that tied together.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting if you look at the history of disability as well, and you know, the fact that industrialization also produces kinds of you know, disability as a kind of as an issue as well in new ways. In other words, when people were working kind of in cottage industries or, you know, outside of kind of factory labor, it was much less likely to be difficult or for them to be excluded in the way they were from certain kinds of labor as they changed. And again, as we move into a much more sort of technologically kind of language based kind of culture, certain kinds of additional needs become much more pronounced and evident. And so there is this kind of relationship between economic organization and the categorization of people as being, you know, disabled or not too. And I think, you know, when I think about, you know, sort of when people ask about emotional intelligence in job interviews, that is, you know, a kind of something that would necessarily kind of exclude particular kinds of people because of assumptions about what that might mean or what it might sort of look like. So yeah, these things are all kind of entangled, aren't they, in the ways that you've described. I've got a kind of question, maybe that Thamisa would like to address, which is, how can universities and colleges challenge institutionalized ableism, especially where it impacts disabled staff? And this is from someone who says they're a former FE and HE teacher who had to retire from teaching because of ableism. So Thamisa, perhaps if you'd like to say something about that.
My mind just went totally blank there. But I think in terms of, because ableism takes different forms, doesn't it? It's the institution, the structures itself, the language that's used across institutions, and how do we manage that? I come from a space where I've not always been disabled, and crossing that space and hearing the ways in which people talk about disabled people, the language that is used, it has to be a case where we are constantly reminding people about the language, about what it means, you know, for us when they are ableist, you know, and calling them out. Really, it is about that. And some people are not very confident to do that, but that's one way you can draw attention to what is going wrong and how to put it right. And I know people talk about educating ourselves. Yes, we do have to educate ourselves, but some people have no idea when they cross that line, when they say something that's inappropriate, when they act or their behavior is not appropriate. Many of us don't know. You know, we assume and we make huge assumptions about those things. So for me, I think it is really about educating, using the resources that we know, looking at the everyday language that we use and the ways in which we could change our attitudes and mindsets, because it is about attitudes and mindset. It's not going to happen overnight, you know.
Do you think there's something about the ways in which, for instance, universities operate for staff as well that you know, is particularly difficult for anybody with an additional need? I don't know if you want to say something about that as well, not just sort of beyond language, but about, you know, the ways in which work is organized, for instance, or expectations, or the research culture, for instance.
Yeah, I think so. I think the ways in which work is organized and how we are perceived and the things we are meant to be doing. So, you know, when you talk about the reasonable adjustments being an opportunity to allow someone to engage in the work and to do the work that they are capable of doing, they just need an adjustment. But that seems as if it's a really big task for an institution. Why should we cater to you? Why should we change things? Why can't you fit into our space and our perspective? And it's always been difficult. I mean, for a person with a hidden impairment, to be constantly trying to explain to people to stop patronizing me, to stop, treating me as if I couldn't do the work when I'm simply asking for support to enable me to do the work. And the support would be the software, the additional time, and those kinds of things were not taken into considerations. So institutions definitely need to do more in terms of understanding that the training that's expected, and I think mandatory training is necessary, in terms of getting all the stakeholders involved in education. And I think in institutions, in organizations, just getting them to understand, because if you don't know me and you don't talk to me and you don't ask me, you won't know that I have visual vertigo and that my brain stops working, and then I do get tired, and then when I start walking I appear drunk, but I am not. It's 10 o'clock in the morning and I simply am tired. That's it. So, but when you treat me in particular ways and institutions, and I'll just give you one example. When I became ill, I was considered a migrant worker. So I was on a visa. And I was told that we would need to change your status. And at that point in time, I had no recourse to public funds. So if you change my status, what would happen to me? What would I effectively need to do? Go home. And I have been contributing to society and to my institution, but then you put me in a position where you treat me differently. Your language toward me is different. Your attitude towards me is different. The infrastructure and the work setting that I'm in is not changing because I have particular needs. So that puts me outside of a sphere which is not inclusive. So I'm excluded from a place where I can do a job if I am supported.
Yeah, Eleanor, I don't know if you want to add something or come in.
Yeah, it just makes me feel that we're kind of going a lot between the reality whereby disabled people are having to fight as individuals all the time for the adjustments, for the entitlements, to be able to contribute and participate in the way that society says we ought to be doing. But of course, it's such a lonely place, and it's so hard, and we get so worn down by it, and that's where the collective really comes in. And I know, here through my work and it within DPAC, I hear so many stories about teachers or lecturers within their institutions feeling really alone. But that's why being part of, I suppose, the trade union means that you can connect with others, because that support and that solidarity, I think, is the only thing that can really stop you from feeling so ground down all the time, because it's so easy to internalize when all the messaging that we hear around us it connects any kind of need for adjustments or additional support as such a negative. It's so easy for us to internalize that, however much you might be a disabled activist. When it comes to yourself, it's so difficult. And I'm in a space where in my life where I freelance at the moment because I can't take the fight inside a workplace at the moment. Maybe I'll go back in at some stage, but for now, on that front, I've been beaten. But then I've been having to fight for benefits. So it's always a fight. Wherever you are, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, I think you can't overstate how exhausting that can be sometimes, and how dispiriting and kind of and the lasting damage, I suppose, it does of having to of feeling that life is one constant struggle, and one constant struggle against also a kind of assumption that that people are not telling the truth as well. So I think one of the most toxic consequences of what you've described as the war on disabled people is that constitutive, deep-seated suspicion that people are making it up as or aren't really what they say they are, and that you have to prove it. And you know, and I think everywhere there's that sort of sense that you have to prove this stuff. And I think, you know, of all the things that's really damaging is that, because that's also the source of such a sense of injustice as well as the kind of, you know, the kind of, again, the systemic issues that you've described, Misa, which are really significant for people. I mean, I don't want to end on we're coming towards the end of it, and I don't want to end on a really negative note, because I think also that there are huge resources of hope to draw on in terms of what people can achieve collectively and what we can do together. And I'd like to invite both of you to kind of to have a sort of final word around that. But before I forget, we've also had a question, Ellen, which is whether or not your book is available as an audiobook.
That's a very good question. So the book came out, you know, in the middle of the pandemic, and so that was the issue. I have been promised January now, but obviously it's quite an issue for a book about disabled people's rights to not have been available in all formats when it came out. But I do think there was, you know, a very real barrier to this. So January, and I'm sorry for the delay.
Thank
Not that
you.
I'm responsible. Sorry.
That's great. It is available in all of the formats, I think, though, and as it's available on sort of Kindle, isn't it, as an ebook and things like that. So
yeah, and I did a BSL summary and an easy read summary, because actually those are formats that don't get published. So that's a whole other question about accessibility in publishing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so we're sort of coming towards the end, so I'm just going to invite you both for some final sort of thoughts or quick reflections on what you'd like people to take away or think about or act on, you know, sort of going forward from this. So I'll go to Misa and then to Ellen.
All right, sure. My plug would really be to read Ellen's book. I think just thinking about the ways in which, you know, as activists or budding activists, or, you know, up and coming young people can really begin to take charge of their lives and understand what it means to facilitate a war, you know, and it would not be a facilitation of the war on disabled people, but we are now counteracting that war with our own little wins, you know. So there's a big war, but every battle won adds to that counter narrative, you know. So having the grassroots engagement in working together, I think disabled people's movement is critical. I think joining forces, you know, I talked about my story and it sounded so individual and so depressing, but I felt alone because I was alone. Nobody understood what to do. Not even my union understood what to do. So I think it is good and it's worth the fight if we can think about the small wins, think about the ways in which we could, you know, counter the war on disabled people by waging our own war and strategically winning small battles. That's it.
Thank you, and that's amazing. And over to you, Ellen.
Yeah, very, very similar. I think if you think about what's stacked against us every time, you know, the grassroots movement achieves a win, then we have to understand how significant that is, and what that reflects about the power that we do have when we come together and we collectivize. And the fact is, Misa, you're not alone anymore. But also, what I've seen, I suppose, the years I've been active in the disabled people's movement, is the way that the trade union movement understands disability politics so much better than it used to. I would I would argue that I think the understanding of disability politics is now better in the trade union movement than within many disabled people's organisations. But the reason for that is because of disabled trade unionists, rank and file, going in and changing this and making sure that the union took on board the social model of disability and got it embedded throughout, and that itself is just, I think, is a big win. So I think that, I think there's a lot to celebrate. I think we should do much more celebrating of our disabled identities, which, for us, it's not about celebrating the pain and distress, it's celebrating the power that we can have.
What a great point to end on. Thank you. I just want to say thank you to everybody who has listened to this. Thank you. I think everybody just kind of slowly went off my screen then. Thank you for your contributions. Thank you to people who sent in questions, and apologies if we couldn't get to them. And for all you CU members, this is to say that everybody will receive an invite to participate in the Everyday Ableism webinar, which we hope as many people as possible will come along to, will attend, and we'll start to have the conversations that we need to make the kinds of cultural changes that we've touched upon this evening. So thank you to you both. Thank you to Rebecca, and good night. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.